Some of the most powerful forms of control are not implemented by force, they just require a certain vocabulary. Psychiatrist Robert Jay Lifton called this loaded language, and it's when a community gives ordinary words extraordinary power, so that in a single label, a single word can replace a complex conversation. So in the LDS community, there are words like anti-Mormon, for example, or worthy, or the spirit, or offended, or prompted. And all these words can carry far more meaning than their dictionary definitions. They don't just describe reality, they can shape how members interpret reality. So loaded language is Lifton's sixth criterion in his book, Thought Reform and the Psychology of Totalism, that I'm reviewing, and this is part 6. And in many ways, this loaded language is one of the easiest to observe because it's literally embedded in the words that the community uses every day. So Lifton noticed that totalistic systems tend to develop specialized vocabulary that does far more than just communicate ideas. It also shapes the perception by compressing complex experiences into this emotionally charged labels. So instead of language helping people think, this language begins to think for them. And this is what Lifton meant by loaded language. It consists of words and phrases that carry a great deal of emotional weight, and they have this predetermined meaning within the group. They reduce complex issues into simple little categories, and they discourage deeper exploration. So rather than inviting curiosity, these specific words often end the conversation. For example, instead of saying, let's explore why somebody left, the loaded label might be, they were offended, or they were deceived, or they were prideful. They condense the reasoning into these little tiny categories. The label provides an explanation before an investigation has ever occurred. And here's why this is psychologically powerful. Language is how we organize our reality. And if a culture gives you only one limited vocabulary to describe your entire experience, well, then your experience itself can become difficult to understand. So this subtle compression of words makes a conversation easier to control. Lifton observed that loaded language tends to simplify complexity, it reduces any ambiguity, it creates an us versus them framework, and it makes any alternative interpretations harder to express. It doesn't just influence what people say, it influences what they're able to think. So I remember just before leaving the LDS Church, I was watching the news about some polygamist splinter group that was under investigation, and the children had been taken from the community and the mothers were being interviewed. And I noticed the vacancy in their eyes and the lack of autonomy. They had the same hairstyle and the same pastel dresses. And then I recognized something really, really unique. It was their limited vocabulary. It became obvious to me that these women lived in a tightly contained community because the language used to describe their challenging experience was almost verbatim. So is their tonality. The emotional charge was so exact it was almost robotic. It was far easier to recognize in these polygamous women and in these more tighter control groups than in my own religion. Because I had exposure to the outside world, I was raised in a public setting, and I was expected to live a full life in the world. However, it didn't stop me from wondering, I wonder what the language was in my own LDS community, and how this concept of loaded language applied to my own religion. It was just one of those things that you don't notice until you leave. As with the other 7 criteria, many active members experience these expressions as meaningful shorthand, while many former members describe them as limiting and dismissive. So whether a particular phrase functions as loaded language, it depends in part about how it's used in context. So here are some examples. The church is true. That phrase is distinctive because institutions are not usually described as true. A church can have true teachings, but saying the whole church is true, it compresses many ideas into one declaration. The doctrine is true, the leadership is trustworthy, the authority is legitimate, the ordinances are valid, and remaining within the institution is the correct path. All those concepts are packed into this teeny tiny little phrase, the church is true. One phrase that carries an entire worldview. And LDS people say it often, and they teach it to their children. Another term is follow the prophet. So on its face, this is straightforward advice, follow the prophet. But within the broader culture, however, it can also communicate a lot more other concepts like trust his leadership, don't rely solely on your own judgment, and safety comes through your obedience to the prophet. A short phrase conveys a much larger framework. And you can get called out in the culture whenever you do anything that would conflict with the concept of following the prophet. Another loaded language is doubt your doubts. Now, this phrase has been influential for many members ever since one of the leaders quoted it in 2013. Some interpret it as encouragement not to make impulsive decisions. However, those who listen to the talk experience it much differently, because when Uchtdorf expressed this term, he was specifically referring to when saints wrestle with questions that could challenge their faith. The phrase can redirect attention away from examining the challenging content and instead back towards questioning the legitimacy of doubting itself. The next term I'll use is the Spirit. The Spirit is one of the most central concepts in the LDS belief, but it can refer to many different experiences depending on the person and the context. So members might describe feeling peace or warmth or conviction or comfort or clarity or awe or love or guilt or caution or some sudden impression. And all these impressions are labeled as the Spirit. It can also become a really broad explanatory label, like I felt the Spirit left, you lost the Spirit, I was prompted by the Spirit told me. In this framework, again, there's a wide range of emotions, intuitions, bodily sensations, inner experiences, and they're all being interpreted through this single theological lens. So rather than first asking, what am I experiencing? What am I experiencing? What am I feeling? What is causing this feeling? No, the interpretation often begins with, the Spirit is communicating. And this doesn't necessarily mean that the experience isn't meaningful. It means the meaning has already been assigned by the belief system. And one of the most important distinctions is that the experience is real. It's just that the explanation is already been interpreted by the term the Spirit. For example, a feeling of peace is real, a strong intuition is real, tears are real, a sense of certainty is real. But whether those experiences are the Holy Ghost, or your nervous system, or your intuition, or your emotional resonance, or a triggered memory, or the pattern recognition, or some combination of all these is a separate question. Different worldviews answer that question differently, but the LDS interpret it the same. So a balanced way to operate in a mind that's not under the influence of thought reform isn't to dismiss spiritual experiences. It's to recognize the difference between the experience itself and the story that we're telling ourselves about what caused it. So holding those as separate questions, it creates space for curiosity without requiring us to deny what we're genuinely feeling. Hopefully that makes sense. Another loaded language is the use of anti-Mormon. So rather than evaluating information on its own merits, these demonizing labels can influence how people approach it before they even examine it. The label itself, anti-Mormon, implies dangerous, deceptive, spiritually risky, not worthy of serious consideration. So another word is the word contention. Now, conflict in our world, conflict and hostility are a real phenomena, and we all experience these as humans. But at the same time, some former members report that simply raising any difficult questions was immediately described as creating contention or being hateful or seeking to create discord. So the term anti-Mormon expands to cover both genuine hostility and respectful disagreement. And it discourages any discussion. So the next term I'm going to go over is called the world. And this phrase often refers to influences outside the faith community. We are the saints, and those who are not the saints are considered the world. And this loaded language gathers so many different people and ideas. Everything outside the world that isn't Mormon, it gathers it up into these teeny tiny single little category called the world. And it can reinforce a contrast between the covenant community and those outside of it, even though those outside might hold a wide variety of values and beliefs. And here's what I call the dirtiest loaded word because it impacts our identity and our value and our worth as human beings. And it's the word worthy. Worthy is one of the most emotionally significant words in the LDS culture. It has formal meanings related to ordinances and covenants and responsibility and rank within the church. Psychologically, however, many former members describe internalizing it as a statement about their value because it's determined by their obedience rather than about their readiness for any specific religious role. And finally, the last one I'm going to talk about is staying on the covenant path. Now, this phrase has become increasingly prominent in recent years, along with the term think celestial. It can describe faithful commitments, and it also compresses many assumptions into one expression. Remain active, follow church teachings, trust the leadership, continue temple participation, and avoid all alternative paths. One complex life journey, and whether it's on track, is summarized by one single metaphor, the covenant path, or think celestial. And here's why Lifton believed that loaded language matters. When language becomes highly compressed, it reduces the need for reflection. Imagine these two conversations. The first is without loaded language. So, tell me what led you to leave the church. It invites exploration. But with loaded language, it sounds like you were offended, or they already tell you what had happened or what must be the problem. Maybe you were deceived. That explanation has already been supplied, and the conversation ends before it even begins. Without loaded language, you might ask, what made you come to that conclusion? With loaded language, oh, well, the Spirit told me. So here is the impact that loaded language has on a nervous system. Many former members describe noticing that certain words immediately triggered emotional responses long after they left. The words like apostasy, worthy, obedience, the adversary, covenant, temple worthy, eternal family, chosen generation, all of this means these words aren't inherently harmful, but repeatedly pairing them with some emotional significance and assigning them to spiritual consequences, it gives those words powerful emotional associations, and it impacts your nervous system. So a healthy use of language versus loaded language. Let's talk about that for a minute. Healthy language clarifies. It expands understanding. It invites dialogue, makes you more curious. It allows nuance. Loaded language compresses ideas. It puts labels on them. It simplifies complex things, and it discourages further inquiry. When all the thought reform methods are used together, these 8 that I've been talking about, they don't simply influence one's behavior. They begin to shape a person's whole perception itself, the perception about themselves and the perception about the world. And Lifton's insight was that the deepest forms of thought reform often occur not by forcing people to think certain thoughts, but by gradually narrowing the conceptual tools that are available for thinking about their own experience at all. So when you leave, you start to understand some of the things that have been done to your mind, and it does feel like your mind is open, and you start to see in technicolor, and you think in different ways, and you value different perceptions that you didn't give yourself permission to value while you were under the influence of the doctrines. So I ask you, what are some of the words that you see and feel differently after leaving? And if this video was helpful for you, please share it with someone who's ready to hear it. And if you are looking for assistance or support while you are deconstructing and reconstructing your life after religion, reach out to me. I'm going to share what I have available for support. And so the next video will be part 7 of this series, and it will be called Doctrine over Person.